What's up, folks? Welcome to another episode of Terry Kavanagh's Unhinged. And I am his co host, Carl Choi, the publisher of 24/7 Comics. I was so sad I missed last week, Terry. What I missed? What happened?
It was a lot of fun. Howard and I know how to spar.
That's what this is all about.
Yes.
In fact, Terry, we spent a lot of time with Terry and hear his stories, and we're just so enlightened by like the golden years at Marvel and like all the fun you guys had. And that was pretty much why we decided to do this show, because there was so many relationships that you've had and stories that we felt like should be documented and be archived on the internet. And so thank you, Terry, for continuing with us with this unhinged stories. So with that said,
only the ones where the statute of limitations is up.
Yes, those exactly. We'll keep the current ones under a friend DA until further notice. So, I mean, Terry, we have a very special guest today. I'm super excited. Would you mind doing the honors of making an introduction of who this special guest is?
Not at all. We're bringing on Tom Defalco, my ex-boss at Marvel. Actually, he'll probably always be my boss. So I can't really put it in the past like that. Ex-boss, good friend, and filled with interesting stories. We might have to drag him out of them, but I think we can.
My gosh, he is my boss of my childhood. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Tom Defalco. Hey, Tom.
The boss.
I'm nobody's boss these days. These days the cats boss me.
So we'll continue in the green room where we're just having a chat. And for those of you tuning in, you are probably familiar with Mr. Rob Liefeld's podcast, Robservations. I listen to it pretty often just to catch up. I think he's become a voice in comics to the public and have been expanding the space. And one of the things he talked about this morning was Archie Comics and how it was a kind of early exposure for him in the comic book space through the Christian bookstores that he was exposed to as a pastor's kid. So Tom was just sharing a little bit more about Archie and that world. And yeah, Tom, please continue.
Well, I always thought it was ironic because Archie was owned by John Goldwater and Louis Silberkleit. Both men were of the Jewish persuasion. Actually, most of Archie staff and the people in the office were Jewish. Whenever they'd have the Jewish holidays, me and one of their accountants was Italian. We were the only two guys that would come into the office during the Jewish holidays. And John Goldwater would, John or Louis Silberkleit would call up every hour to just to make sure we were still in the office.
Oh my gosh.
I worked in the art department, which was way down the hall, so I'd hear the phone ringing, all the way up the hall. So I'd have to stop what I was working on, run up the hall, and answer the phone. And Mr. Goldwater said, "Why are you out of breath? What are you doing there?" I said, I had to run up the hall, answer the phone. And he said, "Well, why aren't you sitting by the phone?" I said, "Because you want me to. You said want me to be here to work. I can't work here. I got to work on the artwork in the art department." It was funny because John. I learned so much from that man. It was like going to college without having to pay tuition. And one of the things one of the things I learned, and I later, told all my guys, is never let your ego get in the way of your wallet.
True.
And
wait, I have one deep dark secret to tell about Tom, now that we mentioned college.
Okay, you can.
Tom, didn't you go to clown college?
No, I did not go to clown college. I, I had been accepted to clown college.
Oh, okay.
But around that time, I got the job offer from Archie Comics.
Oh, okay.
Either go to clown college or, uh, or get a job in the comic book field. I weighed them both.
I could see. And there wasn't that much of a difference really between the two.
I always remember when I decided on, my father was not really happy about the concept of me going to clown college. And when he found out I was going to be, take the job at Archie, he said to me, "Can you make a living in the comic book industry?" And I said, "I don't know," because I had no idea. And he said, "Well, you're young. Go ahead and try it. If it doesn't work out, you'll come up with something else." I think my mother never forgave me for not going into the newspaper business. Because
Almost the same.
I guess it's like media at the time, right? Newspaper would be more buttoned-up version of print media.
Yeah, listen, that looked like a steady job at the time.
Yeah.
And I was working, when I was in college, I started to do freelance writing and, ended up working for the local newspaper. So, she said, why don't you get a job in the newspaper field? You're already there.
Yeah.
But I thought my heart lay with fiction as opposed to nonfiction.
You made it work, Tom.
Somehow or other. I've been managing to fool people for a number of years now.
And we do have a viewer of who loves Archie Comics here, Jay Moo. He's also asking, is clown college an expression or literal?
It was literal. They had a. I'm trying to think of where it was. It was in Florida. The Ringling Brothers had a college to teach people how to be circus clowns.
I have a son, I think, who would have benefited from that.
Listen,
And it was a thing until it killed it all. I mean, it was the horror movies that killed the clown. Clowns was a thing growing up. I remember all the birthday parties of the kids. It was a thriving profession. Like there are guys who are like professional clowns. Yeah.
Yeah, and there was that period where there was some clown standing by the side of the road for a while. It was, I don't know if it was an urban myth or whatever, but people started spotting clowns on the side of the road everywhere, which is creepy as hell.
It's scary, man. Yeah. And I have to say, when I search Tom DeFalco Archie Comics, the first one that comes up is Pranks, Parties, Puppies. What the hell is that all about?
Is that the Reggie and me?
Yes, Reggie and me. Pranks, parties, and puppies. Would you say that's an accurate description of the days at Archie Comics?
Well, sure, why not?
It explains a lot about the culture that you guys brought to Marvel now.
Absolutely.
It's funny when I joined Marvel first as a contract writer, and then at a certain point, Jim Shooter was reorganizing the editorial department. And he said to me, "Well, you've got editorial experience. I'd like you to be an editor." And at that time, I said to him, "Jim, I haven't had a full-time job in years. At Archie, I'd started full-time, but then as I did more and more writing, I cut the days down until I was only coming in like 2 or 3 days a week." And I said, "Jim, I don't think I can, handle a staff job anymore." And he said to me, "Well, can you give me 6 months?" And I thought, I can do anything for 6 months. So I agreed to come on staff as an editor for 6 months. 6 months ended up being closer to 20 years.
Oh my God.
That stuff.
I figured, okay, I'm the new guy, so I'm going to get, all the low selling titles. And he gave me the Spider-Man titles. And I said to him, Jim, I should not have the Spider-Man titles. You should give it to somebody more experienced. And he said, Spider-Man's just like Archie, except with superpowers. And I remember looking and analyzing the thing,
Yeah.
and saying, he's right. Spider-Man is kind of like Archie,
Yeah.
except with superpowers.
True.
And the theme of, to me, the theme of all Spider-Man stories is responsibility. And I figured, I know how to write, write and edit stories about responsibility. So, I was off to the races.
It's cool to hear that origin story. I actually had a question asking what it was like transitioning from, kind of Archie to Marvel. So you answered it all right there.
Well, I really owe all of that to a guy named Joe Orlando, who was an editor at DC Comics. At some point I was working for Joe doing custom comics and then some, humor comics. And Joe said to me, "Have you ever thought about doing the straight stuff, which is the superhero stuff?" And I said to him, "Joe, I love reading that stuff, but it looks so hard. I don't think I can, I don't think I'm really equipped to do superhero stuff." And he said to me, "Kid, you got to be able to handle characterization. You can do that." He says, "You got to be able to plot stories. You can do that." He says, "And here's the kicker. It doesn't have to be funny. They're paying you the same rate, and you're only doing half the work."
Yeah.
And I thought, wait a minute.
That's deep.
That's deep. That's cool.
Yeah.
And here he is right here, right?
Yeah. What?
Mr. Joe Orlando.
Orlando, yep.
Yep. He was a
There it
great guy, a great editor, a great artist. And I owe my, career in superheroes to him, because
Wow.
I don't think I ever would have, gotten out of the humor field if it hadn't been for him.
That's pretty cool. We all kind of owe kind of our time, especially in this industry, to someone before us. I think this whole kind of apprenticeship based art in the arts is really important, and I think a lot of folks don't know that. But the creative field is so hard to navigate. But at the end of the day, it's such a people business that it's really easy to kind of look at anyone who's done something, and if you kind of give credit where credit's due, it's really due to someone else giving you that.
It was absolutely an apprentice sort of based program. When I was at Marvel, at least, you learned the assistant editor was in the same office with the editor, and you heard them speaking to the creators, and you looked at what they were asking for and what they had problems with, and you learned that way. Not 100% sure that still exists in the industry today. I feel like the assistants are separated from the editors, and there's not that learning experience.
We also had the assistant editor classes.
Yes, we did.
Which every assistant editor hated.
Yes, we did.
Until they became an editor or an editor-in-chief at another company.
We learned a lot that way, actually. But you're right, we all hated it. We mainly hated it because, well, not mainly, but also hated it because it took us away from our desks for an hour, and then Virginia would yell at us for not getting the books out on time. But we're just lowly assistants.
But when I became editor-in-chief, I said to myself, we've got to protect the craft. And my wife at the time was a school teacher, so I saw how she did lesson plans. So Grunwald and I sat down and we wrote an entire syllabus with lesson plans, for, I forget if we set it up for, 20 weeks or whatever the heck we set it up for. But we lesson plans, syllabus, we do exactly what we were doing. One of the things we used to do constantly is at a certain point, Grooney would, he'd bring up an example to me. You have to introduce the character. And, and I'm not that bright. So I'd say, well, what do you mean? And he would give one or two examples, and then he'd go, you know, and then he'd turn to the class, and they'd come up with all these other examples because they had to give me a lot of examples because I was not that bright. And we used to pull that trick, at least every other week. And we kept saying, and Gordon kept saying to me, how long can we get away with this? I said, we can get away with it until they learn what we're doing.
Do you really think we didn't know what was going on, Tom?
I have no idea, but
it's called interactive learning, and it's called management.
Yes. And also, Grunwald used to use us occasionally to help him do his work. I remember one particular assignment where he had us do balloon placements on a page of Captain America that he had written, and he had all this copy, and it was, first off, the problem was all these panels were stacked on the left, and then there was a big vertical panel on the right, and he had all this copy he wanted to fit in, so he made us all do balloon placements on it, and then he just used mine in the book. So I'm like, oh, okay, I guess I did them well.
I used to say to him, yeah, Mark and I, Mark was my second in command. He was my first assistant. When I was hired as an editor, they gave us an office that was so small that the only way we could fit in there was have both desks facing each other.
Oh, God.
So, that sounds bad, but the good news is we would pass the pages back and forth.
Yeah.
And we worked very closely together. And Mark and I were very in tune as the kind of comics we liked and that sort of stuff. Which is why when I started getting other executive editors, I got guys who were out of tune with that.
It's funny when you talked about how you're turning around and asking the guys for that reminder. It made me think about this. What's this all about?
That's right.
Where is this from?
That was one of the bullpen bulletins pages, I'm sure.
So it was 1987. I think that was a year. And I pulled it from an article that talks about the classic Marvel year, which I thought was kind of cool.
Yeah, Rick Parker and Steve Saffel. Steve Saffel was the editor of Marvel Age at the time, and Rick Parker came in. They came in and they said, we want to do a comic strip called The Boss Men, which is going to make fun of you and Mark. Can we do it? And Mark and I looked at each other and said, well, let's see what you're going to do. So they gave us like 4 or 5, examples of how they wanted to make fun of us. And Mark and I looked at each other and said, this stuff is not vicious enough. So we rewrote the first couple of strips to really make fun of ourselves. That strip, had me, 200 or 300 pounds over what I weighed at the time.
I thought it was just the power of Odin that was imbued in you.
And it made Mark into this, jellyfish of a whimpering yes man, which he was not.
No.
And we gave it back to the guys and said, here, if you're gonna insult us, really insult us.
And you guys had a good sense of humor. Everybody had to have a good sense of humor at Marvel because, and I've said this in previous episodes of this, just walking into Ralph Macchio's office, you had to be prepared for what was going to happen while you were there, and then it was going to be worse once you left.
Right.
Expand on that, please.
Ralph did imitations of everyone. So you really didn't want to be, you wanted to be the last to leave his office so that he had no one. I'm sure he did the imitations anyway, even though there was no one there to hear them, but you wanted to be the last. And I always wanted to hear what his imitation of me was. You never got to hear him do you. So somebody it probably was Grunwald, planted a tape recorder in there to hear. Wasn't Ann Nesenti talking about that recently? I think.
Yeah, I'm unaware of that. I've got two Ralph stories. One time I'm sitting in my office, and Mike Hobson comes in. Mike Hobson was the publisher. Just a wonderful, wonderful man. Editors in chief really speak of their publishers with affection, but I have nothing but admiration for Mike. He became a good friend, and we would get together, for lunches long after we both left Marvel. Okay, bunch of comments.
Right. When I think of Ralph, so when I search him, this is what comes up. But this him right here.
Yeah, that's Ralph Macchio. Anyway, so
Yep.
Although he has
Put a face to
blonde hair
name.
now, Tom.
what?
He's dyed his hair blonde now.
Yes, I know.
Oh wow. Okay.
He did it to cover up the gray. It's easier to cover up the gray.
There he is.
So Mike Hobson comes into my office and he says, "Do you know what those two idiots are doing?" And I look up and go, "Which idiots?" And then Mike bursts into laughter, and I had this couch there. He falls into the couch, and he says, "They have a fishing pole outside the office." We're on what floor were we on? The 7th floor?
10th floor.
10th floor, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I get confused with offices I've been in. 10th floor. And we're on the 10th floor, and they had like a dark seed character, which they tied with fishing pole string, cast it out, and had a stale candy bar in Darkseid's hand, and they were fishing for pedestrians from the 10th floor. So Mike says to me, "Yeah, it's Carl Potts and Ralph Macchio. Poor Ralph is trying to work, and Carl is fishing for pedestrians there."
Yeah, sure.
And I'm thinking, wait a minute, Ralph is trying to work?
Yeah. That's the question of that story.
What had happened was Ralph had gotten a phone call just as Mike Hobson came in to chastise these guys. And then, Mike just couldn't stop laughing enough, and he says, go there and yell at those guys. He says, "I would do it, but I don't think I could do it with a straight face."
That's hilarious.
And he said, "You think I can do it with a straight face?" He says, "Come on, you're better at yelling at people." So
It's true, he was.
I walked back, and the two of them are in there, waiting to be fired or something. I don't know what the heck they were doing. And I said, "Enough of the candy bar already." So he said, "We can't use the candy bar? Can we use this fake $100 bill?"
Yeah, because the candy bar was the problem.
So that's one Ralph Macchio story. And another Ralph Macchio story. I'm sitting in my office, and the president of Hasbro comes in, and and their chief creative officer comes in, and these were guys I had worked with for a bunch of years. And they're sitting across from me. We're having some sort of meeting about something that they wanted me to do. And at one point, the president of Hasbro says, "Oh, you got business cards. Let me take one of these." And he looks at the business card. He says, "When was the last time you looked at these business cards?" And I said, "I don't know. Why?" And he hands it to me. And someone had crossed out Tom Defalco and put Tom DeFazio on every business card there.
Oh my god!
And
Is it because they read that article with the?
And of course, I recognized the handwriting right away.
Oh my gosh!
Who else would it have been? Actually, couldn't been anyone.
There's that class clown, guys.
That was the class clown. And I looked at the cards and I said, come on, guys, you know what kind of company we are here.
Yeah.
This is Marvel.
Yeah.
I said, that's why you guys deal with us. And they laughed and went out, and then I tried to work up a fake anger to go to Ralph, but I couldn't do it with a straight face.
It could have been Mark. It could have
That was
been
not
either
Mark.
of them.
No, Mark, Mark had different ways of busting my chops.
Okay, fair enough.
So Mark, every time I would go on a trip, I had this big bookshelf with all sorts of Marvel books in there and stuff. He would reorganize my bookshelf. He'd put it in alphabetical order, reverse alphabetical order, character alphabetical order, what the heck ever. And it never failed. And remember in those days I was going on a lot of trips because I was desperate to make one of the other departments profitable. And I'd come back, I'd look at my bookshelf, I'd try to figure out how he had rearranged it, and then next time Mark and I had a meeting, I'd talk to him about something and say, as an example, and I'd reach over and I'd pull out a book that I needed, and then go to the book, and I never mentioned the fact that I know what you're doing every time I leave, but I'm never going to acknowledge it.
Those were fun times.
Fun times. I mean, I'd love to go back to this article too, because it talks a lot about the golden years. You as a chief, the new editor in chief, and then there were a lot of like new artists, a lot of new talent. The guys that has kind of basically been tested by time. Jim Lee, Todd McFarlane, Eric Larson, Rob Liefeld, Silvestri, to name a few. And there were some like very iconic titles that came out during the time. Like when you guys see like Dark Horse, Dark Hawk. I mean, I just wanted to cover this because one of our associates, Swaggerhouse, he's a big fan of Dark Hawk. Any wacky Dark Hawk stories of how this whole thing came about?
Well, Dark Hawk, New Warriors, a bunch of our titles. When I became editor-in-chief, I said to Mark, we're going to try something new. We're going to act as if we're a real publishing company. Because Marvel, previous to me was more, every year you'd sit down and try to figure out what you're going to do next the following year. And I thought, having, done some work for some other, real publishing companies, I knew that you write a novel this year, it doesn't come out for another year. Because they know what they're going to publish this year, they know what they're going to publish next year, and they know what they're going to publish the year after. And I thought, we should be the same way. So I said to Mark, we're going to work out a 3-year plan. So over a couple of weekends, Mark and I put together essentially a 3-year plan. And part of the plan was we're going to introduce some new teenage heroes. We're going to, introduce a team of teenage heroes, and the following year we're going to spin one off into a title, blah, blah, blah. We're going to introduce a separate teenage hero. Because in those days, our primary audience was between, 13 and 16. I used to say we do, comic books for 16-year-olds of all ages.
Yeah.
And mostly boys, wouldn't you say, Tom?
It was mostly boys, but Marvel had a bigger female audience than DC. And part of that is because, in general, males like to see action, and females like to, understand the reactions. What's the story behind this? And Marvel had always been more of a female-oriented company in that we had a lot of action, but it was all a soap opera action. I've always said that most people totally misunderstood what Stan Lee did. because they, whenever anybody talks about Stanley's contribution to comic books, they always talk about heroes with feet of clay, heroes with personal problems, and I always say, yeah, he did that, but so had other people. What Stanley's real contribution to comics is he brought soap opera to comics.
Yep.
Because, what we cared about with Spider-Man was his personal life. What we cared about with the Fantastic Four was the personal lives of the characters. Is the Thing gonna, work out his relationship with Alicia? Is Reed gonna end up with Sue? Is Submariner gonna end up, it was the soap opera of things. Thor, Thor's father wanted him to marry a nice Asgardian girl, but he liked that, Earth girl there.
Yeah, we used to talk about one of the main differences between Marvel and DC was, Marvel comics were more about the men and women under the masks.
Right.
And those were the real identities. If you wanted to figure out what Spider-Man would do in a situation, you had to figure out what Peter Parker would do in that situation. Whereas at DC, it was almost like Batman was the real identity and Bruce Wayne was the fake identity covering for that. So if you wanted to figure out what Bruce Wayne would do in a situation, you had to figure out what Batman would do in that situation.
So when you guys were in office, and during the golden years, like, was Stan around, or was he already in Hollywood? He's kind of moved to the West Coast.
Stan was, on the West Coast, but he was always around.
Tom, I don't know if you know this, but one time, my wife, who was not my wife yet at that point, but she was waiting for me at that bar across the street from the back entrance of Marvel, whatever that was. She was waiting for me at the end of the workday. We would have lunch there occasionally too. And I go over there, and she's sitting at the bar, and Stan was hitting on her hard.
I was just gonna say that. I was gonna ask, was Stan hitting on her?
And I don't even think it was in a creepy way. It was just Stan was about promoting, and he was promoting himself, and she had no idea who he was. So, and she was amused. She really was, but he was hitting hard.
I also asked this, so Tom, just so you know why I asked, is because I met him, and he's such a showman, and literally I remember we met for 2 hours, and like we said like 2 words on our side because he was so into presenting and selling. So my question mark is like, if he was around, how do you guys get anything done? So.
Oh, no. Stan was, Stan with the public was different from Stan outside of the public.
Okay.
Stan's superpower was, whoever he was talking to, he made you feel like you were the most important person in his world.
True.
And all positive. He was all positive.
He was always super positive and that sort of thing. And yes, to the outside world, he was always selling because that's what his job was, to be always selling. But he really was a very sweet individual. I know Stan, in his relationship with his wife, they were married for 50 plus years or something like that. Stan never really looked at another woman.
No, there was nothing
except Terry's wife.
There was nothing suspicious about what was going on. It was just funny. I don't think there was any intent behind it at all.
It's funny. People, often, who created what, blah 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 blah. I will tell you that the reason why nobody documented, who created what, because nobody thought the Marvel Universe was going to last. They were hoping to get 2, maybe 3 years out of those superheroes because they'd already seen superheroes come and go like 3 times already. Yeah. They expected the same thing here, maybe 2 years, hopefully 3 years. But when you look at Spider-Man, every one of the basic characters, it's Stan Lee. Stan Lee is Peter Parker. A guy who could see the dark cloud behind every silver lining. Stan Lee was J. Jonah Jameson. enough said. Stanley was Flash Thompson. Stanley was Aunt May.
That's funny.
I can see that now.
Yeah, one time I was talking to him and I said to him, yeah, I could see how all the characters are you, especially Aunt May. And Stan said, what do you mean Aunt May? There's nothing, like Aunt May about me. What are you talking about? And then as we're walking outside, he said, it looks like it's going to rain. Do you have an umbrella? Is that coat warm enough for you, Tommy?
That's really cool. So he was living Marvel. He was like really the living, breathing Marvel. Yeah.
He really was.
Oh, that's so cool.
And that's why we loved all those characters. It was, yes, Jack Kirby's visuals were fabulous, and I am a hardcore Kirby geek. I, collect all anything with Kirby on it. I'm there. But what made us fall in love with the characters was the personalities that Stan injected. Not just the visuals. Comics are a visual medium. You need the visuals. I always say that we writers, we can bullshit about how important we are, but it's the artists that are really the stars of our field.
Yeah, when someone picks up a comic in a comic book store or on a newsstand, they can see whether they like the art or not. They can't tell whether or not they like the story from just picking it up.
Yeah,
it's true. And as a fan growing up, I know there are guys who just collect comics for the art, but for me, I have to read every book. And even if the art's the best thing ever, if there's no story, I just have no connection to it. And if we look at even art itself in the comic space, all the biggest moments is because there was a solid story behind it. If there's no story behind it, those art pieces are fleeting. Like they'll be hot for a few months and then people forget about them. So I do feel like that perfect balance of the two is super important.
Tom, in service to the title of this live stream,
there we go.
What's your most unhinged story? And it doesn't have to involve me.
My most unhinged story?
All right. You have a moment to think about it, Tom. I'm going to go through some of the viewer comments. We have Jay Mumu, who's laughing his butt off. And then we have Paul with a question, which we'll get back to later. We have Paul says, hi, Carl, Terry, and Tom. Hello, Paul.
Hello.
We have Michael who says, what are you sipping on, Terry?
Sprite Zero.
Sprite Zero. I didn't even know that existed. Sprite Zero.
It's really good. It's my daytime poison of choice.
That's awesome. I'm going to check it out. Southern Comic Geek. He's saying, what's up? And then, wow, Daniel Kelly, who says, tell us more about your wacky son. I'm guessing Fox Kavanagh is somehow related. Terry is more handsome than I thought.
That's my wacky son, who's just realizing how handsome I am now.
And Sherry says Terry's a legend. So Arella is also saying hi. So yeah. So why don't we answer a question and then we could then Tom share your unhinged story. So do you get any writing inspiration from things that are different from comics?
I can answer that actually in something that was pretty relevant. Pitching the Clone Saga, and I've already made my apologies for this, so I don't have to go through that.
Why?
I was there. I witnessed it. Terry apologized to the retailers at Comics Pro this year.
Oh, Tom, I was vilified for years. My Wikipedia page said something like responsible for the abhorrent, Clone Saga story. I got death threats.
And listen, people are still talking about it years later.
Exactly. And Terry, and after Comics Pro, I think it totally changed for you too, right? Because I don't think any retailer was negative, and everyone was like, they came up to me after and was like, "Oh my god, I'm so glad Terry came with you," and like it wasn't anything like you thought. So I think it definitely.
I was nervous they were going to throw tomatoes or
you did say that. You did warn me.
But I can say that my inspiration for coming back there were a lot of elements within the industry. It was that we had, as we aged and got married and got mortgages, we had sort of aged Peter Parker along with that. And we had written ourselves into a corner. We had taken all the sexual tension out of any of the storytelling. And suddenly he was married to the most beautiful model in town. They had all the money. They had a penthouse apartment. and we had written him away from our core audience. And we were trying to address how to do that. And then I remember the Time magazine cover came out with Dolly the cloned sheep on the cover. And I remember thinking, if they're really doing this in science now, then we should be 20 years ahead of that in comic books. We shouldn't be behind. And then that led me to remember that original Jerry Conway story with the clone. And one of the things that was most interesting about that story to me, I could never have articulated this as a kid, was that the clone of Peter Parker is a good guy. So it was two good guys in a bad situation, as opposed to a good guy versus a bad guy, which made for much more complex rooting value. And it just, there was a lot of rich material to mine there. So that seemed to be an organic way to solve our Spider-Man having been written into a place we didn't, we discussed divorcing him, we discussed widowing him. That would have added more baggage. This solution, and it was supposed to end with Ben Reilly as the original Spider-Man. He'd be single, he'd still be in school. We'd write Peter and Mary Jane off into the sunset with a, something organic to Spider-Man. He would, still recognize that with great power comes great responsibility, but now his responsibility would be to his child and his family. So that stemmed literally, what sparked it for me was that Time magazine cover of Dolly the clone sheep.
That's cool. I mean, Tom, you were there. Obviously, Terry was traumatized by it all. But to me, that makes so much sense. Does his trauma have any merit? I feel like, from your perspective at the time, I'm curious.
Well, wait a minute. There's part of this that Terry didn't know, and nobody knew, except for Danny. All right. When they came up with the idea for the Clone Saga, Danny was supposed to keep it a secret, but he came back to the office and told me about it right away.
I knew he swore he would not, because he was going to bring you to the meeting the next day, and we wanted to pitch it to you because we were afraid Danny was going to pitch it as, Tom, you don't really like this idea of a clone, do you? We wanted to pitch it in a positive way, and we knew Danny, who was terrified of the idea, was not going to pitch it to you in a positive way.
Right.
So he swore he wouldn't tell you ahead of time.
But of course he did.
Yes.
And I said to him, there's no way we're doing this. There's not a chance in hell we're doing this. And then I went to the meeting that, the following day, because Danny said, well, listen, everybody wants to do this, so they're going to have to hear it from you. I said, okay, I'll go there. I'll be the bad guy. And then when I got to that meeting, I remember all of you guys had speeches about why this was a great thing. And the guy that got to me was Sal Buscema.
Yeah.
He was very passionate about it, said, yeah, this has never been done, blah, blah, blah. We should really do it. I'm thinking, if this has Sal that excited, Sal had been in the industry, with Marvel pretty much since the beginning. I thought, if my guys are this passionate about it, the readers are going to be passionate about it. And then I said, but we got to figure out what to do with Peter. And I said, you got to give him a happy ending. And DeMatteis said, well, like what? I said, I don't know. He and Mary Jane have a baby or something.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
And then I always remember that he and Howard jumped up, smacked hands, and said, we knew we'd come up with the solution.
That's awesome.
And I said, okay, yeah, all right. So Peter goes.
And Tom, if I remember correctly, hotel security showed up and asked us to keep it down because everybody was so excited and jumping around the place.
Yeah.
I love that. And looking at these covers, I don't know if it brings back memories, but as you're talking about you guys brainstorming, laughing, like getting solutions, high-fiving, it reflects off these covers. Like it was quite a rollout. You guys rolled it out in a big way, and the fun behind it shows.
All right, but here's what the guys didn't know.
Here we go.
I got hold of Danny and I said, okay, we're going to consider this a 3-act play. Act 1, Ben is back, and we find out. We didn't know his name was Ben at the time, but I'm going to call him Ben. Ben is back. Blah 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 blah. And we find out that he's the real Peter Parker.
Mm.
Act 2, Ben takes over, and Peter and Mary Jane go off to have their baby. All right, and Ben is now the new Spider-Man. All right, Act 3, Ben gets into big trouble, and needs Peter to come back. Peter comes back. He manages to save Ben, and then we find out that no, Ben is the clone. The test was jury rigged, and Peter really is Spider-Man. But we end up with 2 Spider-Men at the end of this.
Mm-hmm.
We end up with a single Spider-Man, the Ben Reilly character, and we have the married Spider-Man. And we're going to call Peter and Mary Jane. He's going to be the married Spider-Man. He's going to continue doing that because we had readers growing up with Peter Parker. And now we have the single one. So, and we're going to launch them, we're going to have both, we're going to produce both books. Kind of what we had already done with Thunderstrike and Thor, Iron Man and War Machine. And that I told Danny was the master plan from the beginning. So it was always my intention that Peter Parker comes back. Now, around that time, things got a little wacky. Marvel, in its infinite wisdom, decided, they should, fire me and appoint 5 other editor-in-chiefs.
Oh my God.
They also decided around that time that they were going to distribute their own comic books, which made no sense whatsoever.
Oh, I remember that. I remember hearing about that part. I didn't know about the firing and the 5 chiefs. I mean, I was a fan, so I had no idea.
They also decided that we're going to go from 120 titles to 60 titles.
Oh, wow.
Because they thought the 60 would sell twice as well.
That's math for you.
Yeah, that's very, and all these things happen. What now? If you're going to buy your own distributor, maybe it makes sense. It doesn't, but maybe in some alternate universe, it makes sense if you're producing 120 titles.
Yeah.
If you're producing only 60 titles. Even those idiots, even those brilliant people at Marvel should have been able to do the math and realize you're going to go out of business. But since I was no longer editor-in-chief, I no longer had control.
So let's go back to the unhinged story. Like, what was the most unhinged story in theme with what Terry asked that comes to mind?
I would just like to address something Tom said there. So Tom and I, and I'm sure he will acknowledge this, had a lot of very loud discussions during our time working.
Yes, we did.
But one of the things, and what made me think of this is Tom saying that he came to that meeting with the intention of shooting us all down and saying no to the Spider-Man, to the Ben Reilly, to the clone story. But Tom was really quite capable of listening to what people had to say and changing his mind. Not in every case. You couldn't always convince him. And a good example for me, and I've told Tom this story, and he takes issue with one part of this story, but when I was doing Weapon X for Marvel Comics Presents, previously Tom had come to me and said, sales went down when we did the lead feature with Cyclops and Colossus, etc. So we had to do Wolverine as the lead feature moving forward. And so now we're doing Weapon X, and everybody in the office would come in and see all the Xeroxes and the pages as they came in. And Tom called me to his office at one point, and the head of sales was in the office. And I was informed by these guys that it was too good to go in Marvel Comics Presents. And so it was going to be done as a hardcover, special prestige format book, something like that. And I tried desperately to convince them otherwise. I wanted it for Presents. Barry was doing it in 8-page chapters, etc. But I lost that discussion. So I went back to my office. I stewed about it for a little bit. I went back. The head of sales was gone. Tom was in there. I said, Tom, I just want to get one thing straight. The mandate is I have to do Wolverine stories as the lead feature, but if they're any good, they have to go into some other title. So the mandate is I have to do crappy Wolverine stories every 2 weeks in Marvel Comics Presents. And he stared at me for a minute. He said, sit down. This is where Tom takes issue with me. I think I sat on the floor because I was scared that I was a little too close to the window. He says I sat on the couch. Whatever, it's storytelling.
It's either the couch or the or a chair. You did not sit on the floor.
Okay, fair enough.
And back then they did seal the windows, right? Because all the windows of high rises are all sealed now. You can't open them anymore.
Yes. And so he called the head of sales back in and said, we're going to do this in Marvel Comics Presents first, and then we'll do it, and Barry can redo the coloring for better paper, for prestige format, etc. Yeah. So that was one of many examples of Tom actually, not every boss, you can't say this about every boss in the world. He had an opinion, and I disagreed with his opinion. I gave him my logic for it. He heard it out and then changed his mind. You can't say that about everybody.
Nice.
Well, and I used to always say to people, once you've won your argument, shut up.
Yeah. Yes.
Because one time somebody, came in, they convinced me of something, and then they kept talking. And the more they talked, I realized they were wrong. So I said, you gotta shut up.
Yeah,
that's true.
Because you just convinced me not to do what you want me to do.
Yeah, that's great advice. My one other slightly unhinged story about Weapon X that also involved Tom, and I don't know if Tom remembers this. Tom called me into his office one day about one of the pages, and Wolverine was naked throughout in this big glass tube a lot, mostly covered by bubbles. And Tom, you called me in to tell me there was too much of Wolverine's side thigh showing, and we needed more bubbles. And I said, well, okay, but I can't just take this. Barry will burn the place to the ground if I just take it to the bullpen to add bubbles. So I called Barry and said, we need to add some more bubbles to the side thigh here. And Barry said, I'll be there tomorrow. And he came in the next day, and he and I went into your office, and I was witness to one of the most surreal conversations ever between you and Barry about how many bubbles constitutes enough bubbles to not make Wolverine's side thigh too naked. And I remember clearly saying, I can't believe this conversation is happening in front of me.
Oh my God.
Like Barry pitched 3 more bubbles and you pitched 10 more bubbles. And then the negotiation came down to, I don't know, I'm making it up, like 6 more bubbles was where we settled or something. And I thought I was so bemused by the whole thing. I never said a word, but it was fun to watch.
Listen, Barry and I had this wacky relationship. When I did Machine Man 2020, wow. Herb Trimpe had penciled the first 2 issues, and then Barry happened to see them and decided he wanted to ink them.
Wow! I knew he did.
Cool.
Yeah,
that's cool.
And he wanted to be the inker on that, and then one thing led to another. Issue. Barry was going to pencil the 4th issue. So I gave him, I gave him the plot, and I don't remember the details of the first page, but it was kind of all the characters standing around. Something had just happened, and the characters were reacting to it. And Barry said to me, I'm having trouble with this. I'm having trouble with this. I don't know what to do. And I said, Barry, it's simple. I can sketch it out for you if you want. And he said, we got to talk. And I said, okay, Barry, we'll talk. And you tell me what your problem is. So he came in, and he said, I've tried different versions of this. And then Barry laid out, I think it was 12 fully penciled Barry Smith pages of the same page, and one of them, an arm is up like this, and then the other hand, the hand's here, the hand's here. And I'm looking at these things saying, oh my God, you know, any one of these, I could have closed my eyes and grabbed any one of them and it would have been fine.
Yeah.
And
Terry's amazing.
I said, all right, Barry, here's what you have to do. I grabbed one, you know, looked at one, this figure, but with this hand. This figure with that hand. And he's taken, wait a minute, how about this figure with that hand? I guess I could live with that.
That's awesome. And Barry's one of my favorite artists of all time. So even just hearing stories like this, it just warms my heart. For sure.
Barry, you know, he is a true artist, truly dedicated to what he does. I mean, he puts his heart and soul into every line. You know,
Absolutely.
Just an amazing guy. And you know, now the most unhinged story.
All right, here goes.
I'm trying to figure out. It's between two.
Oh, you can tell both.
All right. One is Team America, number one. We're redoing the issue in a matter of 2 days. Had to completely redo the issue. And at one point, you know, we're pulling an all-nighter at my apartment. You know, rewriting the issue, redrawing the issue, that sort of thing. And about 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning, my wife comes over to me. She's getting ready to go to school. She says, "Excuse me," and I'm sitting at the typewriter. I said, "What is it? What do you need?" She says, "Bob Layton is asleep in our refrigerator."
Huh? What the heck?
And I said, "Do you need anything from the refrigerator?" She said,
Oh my
"No, but
gosh.
I thought, you know, maybe you might want to get him out of the refrigerator."
Oh my gosh.
And what had happened is, you know, Bob wanted a drink of something, either a beer or a soda or something, and it was in the back of the refrigerator. So he sat down on the floor, reached in to get it, and then fell asleep in that
Oh my
position.
gosh.
And I said, "Well, listen, if you don't need anything from the refrigerator, you know,
Let him sleep.
Let him sleep." So that's one story.
That's unhinged.
We're gonna have to ask Bob about that. We had him on another one of our shows, Valiant TLDR, to talk all about Valiant. We should get you guys all together again on a Unhinged episode.
All right. Well, and the other was, so at San Diego. You know, I'm at a San Diego convention. I'm not the editor in chief. I'm, you know, probably the executive editor. I don't even know if I was that at that time. And about 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, I get a call from the police department. Two of my guys need to be bailed out.
Huh?
Two of my guys have to be bailed out. Well, not really bailed out, but we want somebody to come and pick them up. Okay. Get dressed, go down to the police station. Two of my guys who had a few drinks that night were coming home to the hotel. And in San Diego, they take jaywalking very seriously.
Oh, yeah,
And
of course.
the two guys ran into a cop, and they were about to jaywalk across the street. And the cop said, "No, you can't do that. It's against the law to jaywalk." But because they were somewhat inebriated, they thought the cop was joking with them. So they made fun of the cop and
Always a good idea.
jaywalked anyway. So the cop had picked them up and had them arrested. So I had to go down there as the responsible party to pick them up because they didn't want to press charges against these two drunk idiots for this thing. And the two guys were very they didn't want they didn't want me to tell Jim Shooter, who was the editor-in-chief, about this, because they were afraid Shooter would get mad. And I said, why the hell, why'd you wake me up in the middle of the night? So, well, because, we figured, you'd get mad when you'd just yell at us, but Shooter might get mad enough to fire us. I said, oh.
Can you name names, Tom?
It's been more than 7 years, so statute of limitation is.
Bob Layton and Jackson Geis.
Oh, okay.
That's awesome. No surprise.
He was still Butch then, wasn't he?
Yeah, it
Butch
was
guy.
still Butch then.
Oh my gosh.
So what, now this inspired me then to go out and get identification. I knew some guys who could get me different kinds of identification.
He got a guy.
I had a guy, which identified me as a high-ranking member of the DC Comics.
Wow.
So that next time I had to go bail anybody out, I would pretend I was from DC Comics. I also
Well played.
I also used that one time to steal a guy's table at a convention. He had made a reservation, we hadn't. But they said, "Oh, you're comic book guys. Are you so and so from DC?" Yes, I am. I have my identification right here.
That's hilarious. That's the way to go. But Tom, stories like this, as unhinged as they are, like, for me as a fan, it humanizes a lot of the artists and like how much fun you guys were having. Because I do feel, I told Terry this, I'm heavily convinced that there was a lot of extracurricular activities and substances in the Marvel office for you guys to tell such fun stories that allowed us as fans to like be like, oh, I want to be part of that. It was fun. Like it was like a party, and it's captured in the pages themselves. So yeah.
And Tom, speaking of the police, I'm not sure you're aware of this part of this. I'm not going to tell this whole story because I told it recently when Ann was on. But I was sitting at my desk one day and answered the phone, and it was the police looking for Terry Kavanagh. And you had just transferred them to me without any warning. So I just pick up the phone and like, this is the New York City Police, precinct 1 of whatever. We're looking for Terry Kavanagh. And my misspent youth came flashing back. And I said, I'll see if I can find him. And then realized, oh God, what have I done now? And I rustled some papers around and came back and had to speak to them in a different voice the entire time, with Mike Rockwitz, my assistant, staring at me like, what is going on? Who's on the other end of that phone?
And what was that about?
Greg Brooks.
Oh.
That's what it was.
Yikes.
So, but I would have appreciated a little warning from you, like, the police want to speak to you about something that doesn't involve you.
Did I transfer? Or
yes, because they called you and they asked about Greg Brooks, and somehow you knew he was, because of the whole past history with Greg Brooks, you knew he was working with me and said, I'll transfer you to the editor. And I just answered cold, and it was the cops. I would have appreciated some warning.
All right. Oops.
All right, so guys, we're about an hour in, and we're going to probably start landing in the next 10, 15 minutes because actually Terry and I have a call. And so with someone else. Yeah, with Rick, actually. So as we kind of dive into your legacy, Tom, hopefully you'll be open to coming back for another episode. Kind of got my mind turning this morning where maybe we could have multiple guests, Terry. It'd be fun to have, collective memory revisited. But looking at your legacy, Tom, I mean, there's a lot of these iconic covers that inform a lot of our youth and our generation. Any moments or memories come to mind that you could kind of land the ship for us today?
Well, I've told this story a million times about how I got hired to do Spider-Man. When I was executive editor, it was my job to keep track of our creative people. And at one point, Danny Fingeroth comes in and says to me, Roger Stern has decided to leave Spider-Man. And I laughed at him. I said, boy, you're going to have a problem because only an idiot's going to follow Roger. And he says, well, I'm going to need a writer. So I reached over and I had a list of writers. I pulled the list and I went down the list and I made 4 or 5 suggestions on who I thought would write a good Spider-Man. And I look up, and Danny's got this silly look on his face. And I said, I look at him and said, Danny, you're not taking notes. He says, no, I don't have to. I already know who I want. And I said to him, if you already know who you want, why are you wasting my time? And he says, because you're the idiot I want to take over for Roger. And I remember saying to him, no, I'm not the right guy. I don't do that kind of dialogue. And he says, no, you love Spider-Man. You know, you're a good Spider-Man editor. You know the character. You can do it. And I said, nah, Danny, I'm not the right guy for that. And he said, well, Roger plotted 2 issues. Why don't you try scripting them?
Ah.
And I said, all you're doing is wasting your time because you're going to have to hire somebody else. Because I don't do that kind of stuff. And I ended up.
Turned out you do that kind
Yeah, turned out you did because your name is on a lot of it. So, and this scroll, I didn't know it was gonna keep on going, but I feel like it could go on forever, probably at this point. Yeah, I know. Your name's on a lot, covers a lot of books, and even for me, like, brings me back. Like I feel like I'm time traveling right now to a lot of memories during my childhood. So, thank you for that. And Terry, thanks for inviting Tom on this. I hope we could do it again.
Anytime.
No, not anytime.
Tomorrow. But before we go, let's revisit some of the folks in our chat. Some of our viewers. Jane says hello, Jane.
Hi, Jane.
Arella says, Mr. DeFalco, I have your Iceman autograph card from the Infinity Trilogy set. It is my treasure.
Oh,
cool.
Sounds good to me.
Yep. J Momo said, we love Logan.
Okay.
Yep. Southern Comic Geek Machine Man. Carl, you know a little bit about that book. Yes, I love Machine Man. It's one of my favorites. That's why when you guys started talking about it, I was like, oh my God, that's awesome. Will Ben Reilly appear in the MCU from Mr. Fox Kavanagh himself?
Who knows?
Who knows? Yep.
Yeah. Of course, he can ask you at home. You want to ask here. And Magic Machine Pages. Okay, I do own a few Machine Man pages, so I'm excited about that. So I did a little response to Southern Comic Geek. But yeah, with that said, folks, yeah.
Oh, do you own the ones that he inked over Herb, or some of the ones he penciled and inked?
Both. I have a page from issue 4, and I have a page from 2 pages from issue 1. So I kind of want it side by side.
I thought they were a great combination.
Great combination. Yeah, they did a good job. Yeah, for sure.
Herb, Herb is such an underrated storyteller.
I agree.
And he was such a great guy, such a just such a wonderful person.
Really nice guy.
Yeah, we should have a whole conversation about that. I feel like personally growing up, there's so many, as time passed, there's so much talent that just because they weren't out there, at shows or making noise on the press, and they had their heads down, drawing, they were often overlooked and not as valued. But to me, some of these guys like Herb, their works impacted the whole generation, but was not given as much credit as they should have. So yeah, we should definitely, revisit some of these topics as well. But with that said, Terry, Tom, thank you for this. This was an amazing episode of Terry Kavanagh's Unhinged Stories and revisiting some of the Marvel golden years. Thanks, viewers, for tuning in today. And with that said, we'll see you guys next week. And Tom, stay on. We got to upload the content as well as Terry. And we'll say bye to everyone on the stream. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.